What's up, y'all? It's your boy Coffee Kid, where we talk about what it was and what it is. It's the evening of January 28th right now. Reason I'm so overdressed is I just got back from an event put on by the African People's Union at the University of Nebraska Lincoln and some other sponsors. They hosted Cheryl Brown Henderson, who is the sister of one of the original plaintiffs for the case of Brown versus the Board of Education. She was the keynote speaker and shared a lot of interesting stuff today about the state of education for underserved communities, Black people, more specifically. And during the Q&A session, she was asked about a lot of, what is higher level questions like what's the solution? What's the threat? What's the end of the threats? So I think today's climate of talking about critical race theory and the propaganda around that and the misconceptions around what that actually is and what its purpose is and why it's being demonized by certain parties. She was touching on that. But one thing she did mention was the higher problem at large, in her eyes, is colonization. And the problems that we are left to solve in our communities in America is not unique to America. It's everywhere, man. You look at the state of Africa, you look at, South Africa, even Ethiopia, where my mom is from. A lot of that country was colonized as recent as the 60s and 70s. The Italians were there. It's one of two countries that has never been colonized, Ethiopia. And yet, even though it wasn't officially colonized, the Italian influence was very prevalent, and they were in the country with the citizens. They just never formally took it over and exploited its lands and resources like every other country. So yeah, she talked about that as something that needs to be looked at closer, and its effects, how its effects are undeniable in the current context. So with that being said, the video for today is, as you can see, Africa's on the dinner table, eaten by superpowers. This is Professor Lumumba. He is the director of the Kenyan School of Law. Very profound speaker. Very profound takes on the state of corruption in many African states and the division of Pan-Africanism at large. Very interesting speaker. A lot of great things to say about it. So without further ado, we'll get into it.
You can see, first of all, I want to agree with the Honorable Minister. I've done two pictorials. One of them is described as Africa at the dinner table. And if you look at Africa at the dinner table, Africa is on a plate, and it is meat. And the diners at the dinner table are France, the United Kingdom, the United States, the European Union, the Chinese, and progressively the Arabs. And my second picture is the African hotspots. It's not visible from there. But if you look at Africa today and you make a clean sweep with your mind, there are different conflicts of different intensity in Somalia, in northern Mauritania, in northern Mali, in Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Guinea-Bissau, in the Cameroons, in South Sudan, and one can go on and on. And there is a sense in which Africa has always been alive to the question of interference. I will refer this audience, particularly those who are starting, to take time and read the 32 odd speeches that were made in the month of May 1963 by the then heads of states and government of independent African states, the 32 of them. And there are two speeches that I want to isolate for this presentation. One was by David Dacko of Central African Republic. And in thanking Emperor Haile Selassie and Kwame Nkrumah on that day, he said that we must never forget that the colonial power has not left us. We must recognize that he did not go willingly. And if we don't check them, they'll come back again. And what would little Central African Republic do against them? Today, he is right. Today, if we remember the activities of France and how they propped up the regime of Jean Bedel Bokassa, he was right. Today, as the Honorable Minister has indicated, Africa remains the only continent in the world that is referred to in these terms, Anglophone, to mean that we are a sphere of our erstwhile colonizers. About 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting of the Commonwealth in London, England. And a friend of mine who is an Anglophile sent me the photograph very gleefully, saying this is a meeting of 53 equal states. I told him, no. If it were so, why is it that the leadership of the Commonwealth is hereditary rather than rotational? In other words, in the minds of the British, her former colonies are still under her tutelage. And I want to submit to us that in the minds of what I'll call the conceptual West, they think they have a divine duty to instruct Africans what to do. True. And in the minds of many African leaders, they think that they have a divine duty to accept what they are told. That, in my view, is what the Honorable Minister was talking about, the mindset. And this is something that has been examined. We have seen France and its very pernicious presence in Africa. We know what they did in Burkina Faso against Thomas Sankara. We know what they did in Mali or the Sudan against Modibo Keita or against Sekou Touré in Guinea. Pernicious to the core. The Portuguese, we know what battles had to be fought in that area. And let me put this very bluntly. When the former leader of Portugal, Marcelo Caetano, was asked, why can you not allow the colonies to gain independence? This is what he said in substance. As I have examined world history over the years, the following have emerged. That the Caucasians have been responsible for monumental discoveries in the development of man. So have the Chinese, so have the Arabs. But the Africans have been responsible for nothing. They are only fit as hewers of wood and drawers of water. And I want to submit to you who are present here that in the conceptual West's unguarded moments, or guarded moments, that is what they think. And that is how they relate to Africa. So the whole idea that they will interfere is something that they think is their God-given duty. I said there were two speeches in 1963 that I wanted to refer to. I referred to David Dacko. The second one was the speech by Kwame Nkrumah. And Kwame provided the solution. He did not complain about colonialism. He said, we must live here with one army, with one command. We must live here with one currency. We must live here with one currency, one country. I do not know where its capital will be, but I suggest Leopoldville or Bangui. Other leaders may have their thoughts. Kwame was right, but who listened to him? Several years down the line, and I've said it in my paper, there were coup d'etats which were engineered, there were mutinies which were engineered, and other forms of destabilization. And I want to believe that the person who actually said it very well in the 1980s was the former American President Ronald Reagan. He said, the United States of America does what is in her best interest. And I agree with him. Does Africa do what is in her best interest? Do African leaders do what is in the best interest of Africa? Interference will be there in very blatant and brazen ways and in subtle ways. I've always asked, until very recently, how many African countries manufactured bullets? Very few. Until very recently, how many African countries, in fact, how many African countries manufacture jet fighters? How many African countries are involved in the arms industry? Some of the leading conceptual West countries which pontificate to us about prizes, peace prizes, are the leading manufacturers of landmines. And if you look at their foreign exchange earners, it is the military and security items. So they say with their mouths, what do they not believe in their hearts? In Kiswahili we say, vita vya panzi furaha ya kunguru. That when the locusts are fighting, it is the joy of the hawk. Because when they kill each other, they get the food easily, dead. It is in the best interest, I dare submit, without fear of contradiction, that the elite in the conceptual West does not want Africa to stabilize, despite their assertion to the contrary. And you'll see it in every country because conflict is a major industry. Today, you look at South Sudan and the many peace conferences that are being held, but if you ask who supplies the arms, who provides safe havens, it is the conceptual West. And when I use the term conceptual West, I'm saying that it extends to countries which are geographically not in the West, like Australia or Canada. So I'm submitting in answer to your question, Joe, that interference is there, and it is part, to use this old cliche, of the neo-colonial project. The neo-colonial project requires that Africa must remain within the sphere of influence of these states. Today, if you look at the United Kingdom, which has left Europe, one would have thought that those are their cousins and that they should sit in comfort with them. You will now see their involvement being de-emphasized in Europe and their interest and appetite growing towards the Commonwealth. Because in the Commonwealth, they are the major domos. They'll tell us what to do. In Europe, they have to grapple with the Germans and the French, and they don't like it. That is the unspoken bit of it. The French also are in Europe, but the Germans are too strong, and they don't like it. So they want to hold Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, and tell them what to do. I do not know how many of you saw the press conference that was attended by President Macron of France and Nana Addo of Ghana. And when Nana Addo spoke as an African should, you could see the body language of the French president. How dare this man speak this way? In other words, I'm saying that interference is the mother's milk of European economies. But to answer your second question, they have their own recruits who Professor Philip Nying'oro will be speaking here. To use the old vocabulary of those days, they are the people you call their comprador bourgeoisie. You must remember. The comprador bourgeoisie are Africans with black faces, but essentially they are doing the bidding of these powers. They are the ones you'll find them in different spheres. And they will be present. They are in your cabinet, but they are actually representatives of the foreign intelligence agencies of those countries. We know this. If you look at the declassified papers from the United States, we now know that some of leading cabinet ministers in many African countries were working for the CIA. or some Western agency. So you are sitting in cabinet, and in these days of the mobile phone, they are possibly texting their masters in Europe and America. So interference is also exacerbated by these comprador bourgeois for their own benefits. And it has never changed, Honorable Minister. In the early days of slavery, they gave some of the chiefs mirrors and alcohol. Today, what they give them are flats in Paris or in Dubai. And that is what makes them undermine Africa. The third mode of interference is through institutions. Look at the competition as it is now. There is a new entrant into the market that is called China. China is very subtle. Many people wrote the obituary of Rwanda in 1994. 20 years down the line, it has been demonstrated that Africans can actually do it. Between 1983 and 1987, I think Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso also demonstrated that it can be done. We saw in Somalia, despite their problem. So my prescription is African unity. Africa must now begin to negotiate initially in terms of blocks, SADC, ECOWAS, East African Community, and ultimately as African Union. And lo and behold, we must do it. And I've always said this cliche, we must do it, because if we don't do it, we will be done. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, I had to change, man. The turtleneck was a little hot, but wow. Professor Lumumba, Kenyan School of Law, the director of it, man. I mean, he's a bold speaker, dude. Like, the stuff he's saying could get him killed, like, realistically. And he's been saying it for a long time. He served on the anti-corruption board in Kenya, and he must have been grinding enough gears that they kicked him out, man. He was fighting corruption a little too hard. They had to kick him out. They had to get rid of him. You can't fight corruption that hard, my boy. So, nah, but what he's speaking is reality, and it's interesting how he referenced the conference with the 32 African leaders in 1963, right? 32 African leaders. There's more than 32 countries in Africa, so these just happen to be the sovereign nations that are not colonized. And they're saying this on the cusp of fighting tooth and nail to get the colonizing nations out, right? These nations did not leave unless they were pushed to leave. Let's understand that. Now he's saying if we don't leave this conference with one army, one currency, one form of stability and security, a Pan-African security, a Pan-African currency, they will come back. They will divide us. And I mean, you see that today. Is Africa stable? Not by any means, man. Most countries in Africa are third world countries. Yet the nation in and of itself is one of the most resource rich. The continent in and of itself is one of the most resource rich continents, if not the most. So it's interesting how he coins it the conceptual West, because the conceptual West is greater than just the UK or France. It extends to, countries that are first world countries, but are smaller in population, like Australia, Canada, etc. So, yeah, dude, it's a lot of bold statements he makes. But now on the inside, when he references the old Portuguese leader who talks about Africans being diminished to not having any contribution to world inventions or society, which we know is false. We know the first exchange of literary books was in Timbuktu, was in Africa. We know the empires that existed in Africa. We know a lot of modern principles of accounting originated in Africa. So, but not all Africans know that, and I think even African Americans in the States don't know that, because the 400 year history gap in history, a severance in our ways of knowing occurred, right? And I think in that you have a inferiority complex that exists within Africans, that in many Africans, that we do not deserve to make the decisions for ourselves. We need the interference or the help, the aid of the conceptual West through the American Red Cross, through this, the organizations that pour money into Africa via the conceptual West, right? There's a graphic about around $54 billion of aid from these aid organizations enter Africa on a yearly basis, right? 54 billion enters Africa, but 58 billion leaves Africa and is exploited via resources, via slave labor. So we constantly are just putting tape on the holes, but more is leaking out than we're covering, right? And we know that. As the conceptual West, you think they don't know that? I mean, it's a bold statement, but to me, it's by design. It's not a coincidence. It's been happening too long for it to be a coincidence. The root of the problems do not get solved. But as we know, I've said this before, the fruits determine the tree. The tree is judged by the fruits, right? So they're saying the conceptual West is talking about peace, unity, etc., 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 but what are their fruits? Weapons, arms, security systems that they use beyond just defending their country. It's not about defense, it's about offense. So the fruits of their words and what they represent do not match what they say. So Professor Lumumba, man, very, very, very logical, evidence-based thinker, but he's also just observing what's right in front of us. And to his comment about the bourgeoisie, or those with black faces who do the bidding of the conceptual West, right? Later on, I'll be reacting to a different video about American gentleman who coined himself as an economic terrorist, right? He worked for the CIA. This was a TED Talk. He worked for the CIA, and his job was to approach unstable nations, heads of states in which America had an interest in, and some sort of interest in the context of profit, in the context of some form of exploitation, right? He approaches these leaders. He's saying this on the TED Talk. He approaches the leaders. He'll say, hey, we will make you and your circle of friends and family members rich forever, right? But you have to do this for us, whether it's a project, whether it's a power plant, whether it's, a stake in some sort of resource, the export of some sort of resource in perpetuity. You give us that, and we'll make you this small circle of elite rich while the rest of your country suffers and doesn't profit off what's rightfully theirs, right? This is a CIA agent who was groomed from the Ivy League schools, right? I don't want to get too deep in it. I want to save it for that video, but if the CIA is doing things like that, and if you don't comply, killed you. He references a couple different leaders that mysteriously died in plane crashes. So, I mean, we see this stuff in movies, right? this is the stuff of movies, but we know the CIA is in Hollywood, right? We know they have a very, very heavy influence in what gets shown and what narrative gets portrayed in movies, right? So we say art imitates life. And we, the people, look at it and be like, oh, that's such a creative piece of art. But no, it's happened before in many cases. And the morals of the characters of these CIA agents in the movies are always valiant. We're serving America's interests. Yeah, just like he said, they are serving the conceptual West interest at the expense of African bodies. So oftentimes history repeats itself. Like he said like those leaders said in 1963, if we don't do this, they will come back. If we don't unite, they will come back. And they did. It's 2023. They're there, man. Uprooting democracies in Africa. The hand under the shadows, under the table, giving money in exchange for instability and the chance to go in and exploit resources with no questions asked and no resistance because the country is unstable. Yeah. It's just an observation, man. Just an observation. But with that being said, I'm going to just leave it there. Leave y'all to reflect if you made it to this point in the video. But, yeah. It's your boy Kaffa Kid, where we talk about what it was and what it is. If you have any thoughts, please leave something in the comment if you're courageous enough. If you enjoyed the video, like, subscribe. Much appreciated, man. But yeah, thanks for watching. I'm out.